England under Henry VIII had only one legitimate heir, Princess Mary, a female. At the same time, the king spent treasury money to hire private guards and royal tutors to educate his illegitimate son, Henry FitzRoy. Favoring this boy created a practical risk. The court could entirely choose a bastard to become king instead of a legitimate girl. The woman who gave birth to this child was Bessie Blount, a lady-in-waiting from minor nobility who coincidentally caught the king's eye, gave birth to a healthy boy, then got married and left to live on rural estates. She did not demand to strip Princess Mary of her rights, yet her ability to produce a healthy son provided the living precedent Henry needed when the English Parliament later passed an act allowing the king to designate his successor at his own discretion. Bessie was born between 1498 and 1502 in Kinlet, Shropshire, near the Welsh Marches. This region was far from the comfortable aristocratic circles of London. It functioned as a heavily militarized frontier zone. Local families like hers were expected to defend the territory and maintain strict loyalty to the crown. The Blounts were provincial gentry with a strong history of royal service. Her grandfather, Sir Thomas Blount, fought for King Henry VII at the Battle of Stoke in 1487. The king knighted him on the battlefield for his efforts. Later, he served as a canopy bearer at Prince Arthur's funeral in 1502. Bessie's father, Sir John Blount, maintained this close relationship with the Tudor monarchy. He fought alongside King Henry VIII in France during the 1513 Battle of the Spurs. His military service advanced his position at court. He eventually became a king's spear, joining the elite unit responsible for the monarch's personal protection. Her mother, Catherine Peashall, shared a similar background of military duty and court service. She was the daughter of Sir Hugh Peashall, who served as a Knight of the Body to Henry VII. This marriage united two provincial families whose social status relied entirely on landholding, military readiness, and royal loyalty. Their marriage had itself been arranged remarkably early. The agreement was formalized in 1491, when John was still a child and Catherine was only slightly older. Like many marriages among landholding families, the arrangement was intended primarily to consolidate property, inheritance, and regional influence, rather than to reflect personal choice. Bessie was their eldest daughter. Her position within an ambitious gentry family meant that her usefulness to the family was not limited to marriage. A daughter who could enter the royal household could provide access to patronage, court connections, and advantageous alliances. The Blounts therefore invested heavily in preparing her for precisely that environment. She received an unusually strong education for a provincial gentrywoman. She learned to read and write, developed familiarity with courtly manners, and became highly accomplished in music. Singing and playing the lute were particularly valuable skills in the Tudor court, where music was not merely private entertainment, but an important part of elite social life. Her surviving connections with important literary manuscripts, including works associated with John Gower and Geoffrey Chaucer, also suggest that her education extended well beyond the most basic domestic training expected of many women of her background. This preparation had a practical purpose. The royal court was one of the most competitive social environments in England. Families that successfully placed their children inside the royal household gained direct access to influential nobles, ministers, diplomats, and potentially the monarch himself. For daughters, a position close to the queen could lead to marriages that would otherwise have been unavailable to a family of provincial standing. Around 1512, Bessie was sent to London. She was still very young, probably between 12 and 14 years old. Her family wanted her to obtain a position as a maid of honor in the household of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. The Blounts could not rely on status alone. Many families with greater wealth and higher rank wanted exactly the same positions for their daughters. Securing a place therefore required patronage. One of the family's most useful connections was William Blount, 4th Baron Mountjoy. Mountjoy was not simply another distant aristocratic relative. He was a respected humanist, had studied under Erasmus, and held the important position of Chamberlain to Queen Catherine. Another relative, Sir Edward Darrell, served as the Queen's vice-chamberlain. Through these connections, Bessie was able to enter a household that would otherwise have been difficult for a provincial gentry girl to reach. The position of maid of honor should not be confused with ordinary domestic service. Bessie was not brought to court to perform menial household tasks. Maids of honor were unmarried young women of respectable families who lived close to the Queen and participated in court ceremonies, entertainments, and social events. Their presence also served a political function. By taking the daughters of loyal families into the royal household, the monarchy strengthened its connections with the provincial elite. For the girls themselves, the position offered extraordinary opportunities. They lived in an environment where marriages, offices, financial favors, and political relationships were constantly negotiated. A successful maid of honor could attract the attention of wealthy courtiers who might never otherwise encounter her family. Bessie initially received a reduced salary because of her youth, but she appears to have adapted quickly. By the autumn of 1513, she had become a full maid of honor and received the standard salary associated with the position. Catherine of Aragon's household was a complicated environment. The Queen was deeply religious and maintained a disciplined, devotional life. Prayer, charitable activity, religious observance, and contact with theologians formed an important part of her household. Yet the same chambers were also part of the political and cultural theater of the Renaissance court. Foreign ambassadors had to be entertained. Royal marriages and diplomatic alliances were discussed in settings where formal ceremony mixed with music, dancing, poetry, and carefully controlled forms of courtly flirtation. The ability to sing well, dance confidently, and participate in courtly entertainment could make a young woman highly visible. Bessie excelled in precisely these areas. The chronicler Edward Hall later described her as a woman who surpassed others in singing, dancing, and in all goodly pastimes. That description helps explain why she attracted attention so quickly. Her value at court did not come from political ambition. It came from her ability to perform the cultural role expected of a young woman in the Queen's circle. At the same time, Henry VIII was still very different from the image most commonly associated with the later years of his reign. During the 1510s, he was a young king in his 20s, physically strong, exceptionally tall by contemporary standards, and deeply invested in demonstrating his athletic and martial abilities. He competed in tournaments, hunted frequently, played music, participated in elaborate court entertainments, and cultivated the image of a Renaissance warrior prince. European visitors often commented on his physical presence. The enormous, unhealthy king of his final years had not yet emerged. The social organization of the palace was designed, at least in theory, to limit unrestricted contact between the king's male household and the women serving the queen. Female honor was closely connected to family reputation, and the court maintained separate spaces for men and women. But court entertainment created opportunities to cross those boundaries. One of Henry's favorite forms of entertainment was the masque. These performances involved elaborate costumes, disguises, music, dancing, and carefully staged entrances. The king and selected male courtiers could appear disguised or masked and enter spaces associated with the queen and her attendants under the pretense of theatrical entertainment. The identities of the participants were often hardly secret, but the conventions of the masque allowed behavior that would have been more difficult under ordinary court protocol. During the Twelfth Night celebrations of 1514, Henry participated in one of these events. Bessie appeared dressed in white satin lined with blue velvet. According to the chronology preserved in contemporary records, This was the occasion when the young maid of honor became the particular focus of the king's attention. From that point, the relationship between Henry and Bessie developed into something much more significant than a single courtly flirtation. The enormous difference in power between them defined their dynamic. Henry was the King of England. Bessie was a teenage daughter of a provincial gentry family whose position at court depended directly on royal favor and patronage. Whatever personal feelings existed between them cannot be reconstructed because no letters or private conversations survive. There is therefore no reliable basis for describing the relationship as a great romance. Nor can Bessie's choices be treated as though she possessed the freedom of someone outside the Tudor court system. Rejecting the king could have consequences extending far beyond her own position. Her father's advancement, her family's access to patronage, and their standing within the royal household could all be affected. The relationship was consequently managed with extreme discretion. One of the central figures in maintaining that secrecy was William Compton, a close companion of Henry VIII, and one of the men with unusually intimate access to the king. Compton could act as an intermediary between Henry and women whom the king wished to meet privately. The palace contained controlled entrances, private staircases, and restricted passages that allowed movement away from the formal public spaces of court. Through this system, Bessie could meet Henry without creating the type of public scandal that might have immediately reached Catherine of Aragon or foreign diplomats. Secrecy mattered because the Queen was not merely Henry's wife. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and her marriage carried major diplomatic importance. Open humiliation of the Queen could therefore have consequences well beyond the royal household. Bessie seems to have understood the limits of her position unusually well. She did not publicly challenge Catherine. She did not attempt to present herself as an alternative queen. She did not use her access to the king to create an obvious political faction around herself. That restraint may explain why the relationship lasted much longer than many of Henry's other extramarital relationships. The surviving evidence does not consist of romantic letters. Instead, the relationship can be followed indirectly through changes in the fortunes of the Blount family. In July 1514, Sir John Blount received a substantial payment of £146 from the king. Over the following years, his status continued to improve. By 1518, he had become an esquire of the body, a position that placed him among the men with regular access to Henry's private household. Such advancement did not require Bessie to make public demands. Her family was rewarded while she remained discreet. The arrangement continued for approximately 4 or 5 years, an unusually long period, considering Henry's later reputation for rapidly shifting romantic interests. During those years, Bessie occupied an unusual position. She remained subordinate to the Queen while privately maintaining a relationship with the Queen's husband. She could benefit from royal favor, but the relationship gave her no formal security. There was no legal status attached to being the king's mistress. If Henry lost interest, Bessie could be removed from court with little ability to influence what happened next. For several years, however, the arrangement remained stable. Then, late in 1518, that stability ended. Bessie became pregnant. Pregnancy transformed what had been a carefully concealed private relationship into a political problem. A royal mistress could be hidden. A child potentially fathered by the king was more difficult to manage, particularly when the legitimate royal marriage was already defined by repeated reproductive disappointment. Her daughter Mary, born in 1516, remained the only surviving legitimate child of Henry VIII. The absence of a surviving son created a serious dynastic problem. The Tudor dynasty itself was relatively young, and Henry understood the political dangers that could follow a disputed succession. The Wars of the Roses remained part of living political memory. A female heir was not automatically impossible, but Henry increasingly wanted a male successor whose claim would be difficult to challenge. Bessie's pregnancy therefore had to be concealed from the Queen's household while also being protected, because the child might have direct importance to the king. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief minister, became involved in managing the situation. Bessie was quietly removed from Catherine's household. Rather than remaining in London where her pregnancy would soon become obvious, she was sent to the Augustinian Priory of St. Lawrence at Blackmore in Essex. The place was sufficiently comfortable for someone receiving royal protection, but distant enough from the center of court to provide privacy. Within Henry's circle, Blackmore was associated with the name Jericho. There Bessie effectively disappeared from public court life. For years she had been visible among the Queen's maids, singing, dancing, and participating in the elaborate social world surrounding the Tudor monarchy. Now she was isolated from that environment, while Wolsey and the king waited to discover whether the pregnancy would produce another daughter, a child who died shortly after birth, or something far more consequential. By the spring of 1519, the pregnancy was approaching its end. For Henry VIII, the question had implications that went beyond his relationship with Bessie. The birth at Blackmore would therefore provide information that Henry could interpret in intensely personal and dynastic terms. On June 15, 1519, Bessie went into labor. The child was a boy, and unlike the sons Henry had previously lost, this infant survived. The birth of Henry FitzRoy on June 15, 1519, immediately changed Bessie Blount's position. Until that moment, her relationship with Henry VIII had been private and politically manageable. The arrival of a healthy male child made secrecy much more difficult, because the baby represented something the king had repeatedly failed to obtain within his marriage: a surviving son. Henry chose not to conceal the child completely. Instead, he acknowledged him openly and gave him a name that made his parentage unmistakable. The boy was called Henry FitzRoy. The first name directly connected him to his father, while FitzRoy, derived from Norman French, literally indicated that he was the son of a king. Henry VIII was therefore doing more than privately accepting responsibility. He was publicly identifying the child as royal blood. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey became FitzRoy's godfather, which further demonstrated that the boy was not being treated as an embarrassing secret. The king's most powerful minister was personally involved in his early life. This did not make FitzRoy legitimate. Under English law, he still stood outside the normal succession because he had been born to an unmarried woman, while Henry remained married to Catherine of Aragon. Nevertheless, legitimacy and political usefulness were not exactly the same thing in the Tudor world. A recognized royal bastard could still receive titles, estates, education, and an important place within the monarchy. More importantly, FitzRoy's existence affected how Henry interpreted the increasingly serious problem of the succession. Catherine of Aragon's well-documented miscarriages and stillbirths now stood in stark, humiliating contrast to this triumph. The psychological blow to the king was immense. His legitimate son, born in 1511, had barely survived weeks, convincing him his marriage was cursed. Now, a provincial mistress had delivered the biological proof he craved, transforming a private affair into a profound dynastic crisis. By 1519, Princess Mary, born in 1516, was Catherine's only surviving child. Henry loved and publicly valued Mary, but a daughter did not provide the kind of dynastic certainty he wanted. The Tudor dynasty remained relatively new. Henry VII had won the throne at Bosworth in 1485 after decades of civil conflict. Memories of the Wars of the Roses were still powerful among the political elite. Henry VIII had grown up knowing that unclear succession arrangements could encourage rival claims, rebellion, and potentially another period of civil war. For him, producing a male heir was not simply a matter of personal preference. He increasingly treated it as a political necessity. FitzRoy therefore carried unusual symbolic weight. His survival showed Henry that he was capable of fathering a healthy son. According to the assumptions about reproduction common in the 16th century, this encouraged Henry to look more critically at Catherine. Medical understanding of fertility was limited, and reproductive failure was often blamed disproportionately on women. The implications became more serious as Catherine grew older. When FitzRoy was born, there was still some possibility that the Queen might become pregnant again. But with each passing year, the likelihood declined. The existence of an acknowledged male child outside the marriage made the contrast increasingly difficult for Henry to ignore. Bessie herself did not use the birth to challenge Catherine. There is no evidence that she attempted to establish herself as a rival to the Queen or demanded political recognition because she had produced the king's son. Her role in Henry's private life effectively ended after FitzRoy's birth. This restraint separated her from later royal mistresses, particularly during the crisis surrounding Anne Boleyn, who became deeply entangled with factional politics. Bessie did not follow that path. With FitzRoy securely absorbed into the royal machinery, Henry's physical relationship with Bessie ceased to serve any dynastic utility. The king possessed the biological proof he craved, and a son whose upbringing could be controlled directly by the crown. The mother of this child now required immediate extraction from the court's inner circle to maintain diplomatic peace. Bessie, meanwhile, needed a respectable future outside the position of royal mistress. For the next several years, FitzRoy was carefully raised under royal supervision. His childhood was not that of an ordinary illegitimate child. Henry invested heavily in his education, household, and public status. The boy gradually became one of the most important potential alternatives available to the king if the legitimate succession continued to fail. By the middle of the 1520s, that failure had become impossible to overlook. Catherine was approaching 40, and the likelihood of another successful pregnancy was becoming extremely small. Princess Mary remained Henry's legitimate heir, but the king was increasingly reluctant to accept a future in which the Tudor crown depended entirely on a woman. Against this background, FitzRoy's position changed dramatically. On June 18, 1525, when he was 6 years old, FitzRoy participated in a major ceremony at Bridewell Palace. Henry granted him the titles Earl of Nottingham and Duke of Richmond and Somerset. The scale of the elevation was extraordinary. He was no longer simply the acknowledged illegitimate son of the king. He was being placed among the highest-ranking aristocrats in England. The titles themselves were carefully chosen. Richmond carried a direct association with the Tudor dynasty. Before becoming king, Henry VII had been Earl of Richmond. The title was therefore closely connected with the rise of Henry VIII's own family. Somerset also had dynastic significance because of its association with the Beaufort line, through which the Tudors traced part of their claim to the throne. These were not casual honors given to a favored child. Henry was deliberately clothing FitzRoy in titles connected with royal ancestry. The elevation placed the 6-year-old boy above almost every nobleman in England. Only the king himself held unquestioned precedence over him. At the time, England had very few dukes, making FitzRoy's status even more conspicuous. The ceremony inevitably raised questions about Henry's intentions. Was FitzRoy being prepared merely for a distinguished aristocratic career, or was the king considering him as a possible successor? Henry never publicly settled the question at this stage, but his actions ensured that it remained open. FitzRoy's new rank meant that if a succession crisis developed, he would already possess the wealth, education, titles, and public recognition necessary to become a serious political figure. The king then sent him north to Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire. FitzRoy became the nominal head of the Council of the North and was also associated with the defense of the Scottish frontier. A 6-year-old obviously could not personally govern northern England or command military operations. Experienced officials performed the practical work. The importance lay in symbolism. By placing his son at the head of the Northern administration, Henry was presenting FitzRoy as a representative of royal authority. The arrangement also gave the boy experience, at least institutionally, with the machinery of government. It resembled the traditional practice of sending royal children to important regional centers where they could develop independent households and learn the expectations of rule. FitzRoy's household was enormous. It reportedly contained around 245 servants, officials, tutors, and attendants. His annual income exceeded £4,000, funded partly by estates in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. In practical terms, this made a small child one of the wealthiest individuals in England. The size of his establishment reflected Henry's intentions. FitzRoy was not being raised quietly on the margins of society. He was being trained and displayed as a prince in everything except legal legitimacy. Education formed a central part of this preparation. Henry ensured that his son received the type of humanist training expected of a future ruler or senior statesman. Richard Croke taught him Latin, Greek, and elements of political philosophy. John Palsgrave instructed him in French, an essential language for diplomacy and international court culture. His education also included physical preparation. Horsemanship, archery, hunting, and other martial skills were considered essential for aristocratic men, particularly those connected to the royal family. Henry had built much of his own early image around physical strength, military ability, and athletic performance. FitzRoy was trained according to the same ideals. As the boy grew older, his existence became increasingly connected with the king's larger marital crisis. Henry's concerns about his marriage to Catherine had been developing over time, but during the 1520s they became more focused. He began to argue that the marriage itself might never have been valid, because Catherine had previously been married to his older brother, Arthur Tudor. Henry increasingly relied on a passage in Leviticus that warned against marrying a brother's widow and associated such unions with childlessness. The argument was complicated because Catherine had always maintained that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. A papal dispensation had also allowed her to marry Henry. Nevertheless, Henry came to believe, or at least insist, that his failure to obtain a legitimate surviving son was evidence that the marriage had offended divine law. FitzRoy strengthened Henry's personal certainty. Whatever theological arguments surrounded Catherine's pregnancies, the king could point privately to an undeniable fact. Another woman had given him a healthy son. This did not mean that FitzRoy alone caused Henry's attempt to annul his marriage. The great matter developed from a mixture of dynastic anxiety, theology, law, personal desire, and Henry's later relationship with Anne Boleyn. But FitzRoy's existence mattered because it removed one possible explanation for the crisis. Henry could no longer easily believe that he himself was incapable of producing male children. The boy also provided a possible emergency solution. As negotiations over Catherine's marriage became increasingly difficult, European diplomats and church officials considered several unusual ways of resolving the Tudor succession. One of the most extraordinary emerged in 1528 when the papal representative Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio discussed the possibility of obtaining a dispensation that would allow FitzRoy to marry his half-sister, Princess Mary. The proposal appears astonishing. Even in the 16th century, such a marriage would have required exceptional papal authorization. Yet, the fact that it could be discussed at all demonstrates the severity of the succession problem. A marriage between Mary and FitzRoy would theoretically have united Henry's legitimate daughter with his acknowledged son. Their descendants would have carried royal blood from both sides, potentially reducing the danger of competing claims. The proposal was never implemented, but FitzRoy's involvement in such discussions shows how seriously his political importance was taken. While her son was moving closer to the center of dynastic calculations, Bessie was building a very different life. Her relationship with Henry had ended, and the crown needed to establish her securely within respectable aristocratic society. Leaving a former royal mistress unmarried and financially dependent could create problems. A suitable marriage would protect her reputation, reward her family, and remove any possibility that she might become a source of political embarrassment. Cardinal Wolsey again played a central role. Around 1522, Bessie married Gilbert Talboys, heir to the Talboys family of Kyme in Lincolnshire. The marriage was advantageous but complicated. Gilbert came from a substantial landholding family, yet his father, George Talboys, had suffered from severe mental illness. As a result, the family estates were entangled in questions of wardship and royal control. For Bessie, however, the match offered something valuable, a permanent position outside the royal household. The crown took unusual measures to strengthen her financial security. In 1523, an Act of Parliament released significant portions of the Talboys estates to provide Bessie with a jointure. This meant that she would possess income and property rights capable of supporting her even if she became a widow. The arrangement was generous. Rather than simply giving Bessie a temporary payment, Henry's government helped establish her within an important landed family and secured her long-term independence through property. Bessie moved to South Kyme in Lincolnshire and began the next stage of her life. The contrast with her earlier years at court was substantial. At Greenwich and Westminster, she had existed inside a highly competitive environment where her position depended on the attention of the king. In Lincolnshire, she gradually became a regional landholder, wife, and mother whose authority rested on property and family connections. Gilbert's career also advanced. He was knighted in 1524. In 1526, he served as High Sheriff of Lincolnshire. 3 years later, in 1529, he was elevated to the peerage as Baron Talboys of Kyme. This promotion formally transformed Bessie into Lady Talboys and placed her among the titled aristocracy. The continued advancement of her husband suggests that Henry had not simply forgotten Bessie after their relationship ended. The king maintained a quiet form of patronage toward the family, but without bringing her back into his intimate political circle. Bessie and Gilbert had 3 children together: Elizabeth, George, and Robert. These children were fully legitimate members of the Talboys family and gave Bessie the conventional dynastic position that she had never possessed while serving as the king's mistress. Meanwhile, Henry FitzRoy remained separated from her. The boy belonged politically to his father's world. His household, education, titles, and future were controlled by the monarchy rather than by Bessie. Her biological connection to him did not give her authority over his upbringing. This separation was one of the realities of royal illegitimacy. Bessie had given birth to FitzRoy, but once Henry acknowledged the child, he became a dynastic asset of the crown. By the end of the 1520s, the lives of mother and son had therefore moved in opposite directions. Bessie was settling into the life of a wealthy Lincolnshire noblewoman. FitzRoy was being prepared for a role whose final purpose remained deliberately undefined. Then Bessie's circumstances changed again. In April 1530, Gilbert Talboys died. Bessie was still only in her early 30s, but she was now a wealthy widow with substantial property rights, aristocratic status, several legitimate children, and a unique connection to the king through FitzRoy. For the first time in her adult life, she possessed significant financial independence and a degree of personal choice that had been almost impossible when she entered Catherine of Aragon's household as a young maid of honor. That independence would soon become clear when another powerful aristocrat attempted to make her his wife. Bessie Blount's widowhood in 1530 marked another major change in her position. For most of her adult life, important decisions had been shaped by other people, first by the family that placed her at court, then by Henry VIII, and later by the political arrangements surrounding her marriage to Gilbert Talboys. After Gilbert's death, however, Bessie controlled considerable property in her own right. At roughly 32 years old, she was wealthy, connected to the royal family through Henry FitzRoy, and no longer dependent on finding another husband for financial survival. This independence became clear in 1532 when Lord Leonard Grey attempted to marry her. Grey was a considerably older aristocrat with important connections of his own. He was a grandson of Elizabeth Woodville and therefore connected by blood to the Yorkist and Tudor royal families. He also belonged to the political world surrounding the crown and would later become deeply involved in royal government. On paper, Grey represented the kind of match many widowed noblewomen might have been expected to accept. He had status, political connections, and enough resources to make the marriage advantageous. According to the surviving account, he approached Bessie with substantial financial inducements. She refused him. The decision was significant because it demonstrated how far her circumstances had changed since her youth. When she entered Catherine of Aragon's household, Bessie had possessed very little control over the direction of her life. Her position depended on family patronage and royal approval. By the early 1530s, property had given her the ability to reject a politically useful marriage without risking financial ruin. Instead, Bessie chose Edward Clinton. The marriage was striking for several reasons. Edward Clinton, the 9th Baron Clinton, was considerably younger than Bessie. He was about 20 years old, while she was already in her early 30s. He was also still technically a royal ward, which meant that the crown retained legal influence over his marriage and estates. Despite the age difference, the match made practical sense. The Clinton and Talboys estates lay close to one another in Lincolnshire. Combining their local interests strengthened both families. But the fact that Bessie rejected Leonard Grey and married the much younger Clinton suggests that personal preference played a larger role than it had in her first marriage. The marriage appears to have been successful. Bessie and Edward had 3 daughters together: Bridget, Catherine, and Margaret. All 3 later married into important aristocratic families, extending Bessie's influence through another generation. Edward Clinton would eventually have a long and distinguished career, although much of it developed after Bessie's death. He became a prominent naval commander and later rose to the rank of Earl of Lincoln. During the years of their marriage, however, he was still a young nobleman building his position. Henry VIII did not obstruct the marriage. His treatment of the couple indicates that he continued to regard Bessie favorably without attempting to restore their former intimacy. The king granted them an annual allowance of 3 tons of Gascon wine from the port of Boston. Such a grant was modest compared with the extraordinary favors surrounding FitzRoy, but it was nevertheless a visible sign that Bessie remained within the wider network of royal patronage. By this stage, Henry's personal life had changed beyond recognition from the years when Bessie had first known him. The effort to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had become an international political struggle. When papal approval for an annulment failed to materialize, Henry progressively rejected papal authority in England. He married Anne Boleyn, and Parliament passed a series of measures that transformed the constitutional and religious relationship between England and Rome. Bessie was no longer at the center of these events, but the son she had given Henry remained closely connected to the succession problem that helped drive them. FitzRoy was now a teenager. He had grown up with the status, household, education, and privileges of a royal prince. His position became even more important as Henry's legitimate family became politically unstable. Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, in September 1533. Henry had expected a son. Although Elizabeth was healthy, the arrival of another daughter failed to solve the succession problem. Anne subsequently experienced unsuccessful pregnancies, leaving Henry once again without the legitimate male heir he wanted. At the same time, Princess Mary's position had deteriorated dramatically. Because Henry had declared his marriage to Catherine invalid, Mary was stripped of her status as legitimate princess. She was legally treated as illegitimate and removed from the direct succession. FitzRoy therefore occupied an increasingly unusual position. He was illegitimate but openly acknowledged. He was male, enormously wealthy, and had been raised in a manner resembling a legitimate prince. His existence offered Henry an alternative if every other solution failed. The king strengthened FitzRoy's political connections through marriage. FitzRoy married Lady Mary Howard, daughter of Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. The Howard family stood among the most powerful aristocratic houses in England. Mary Howard was also a first cousin of Anne Boleyn, whose mother belonged to the Howard family. The marriage connected Henry's illegitimate son to one of the strongest noble networks in the country. It also made FitzRoy's future more politically important. If he eventually received some form of recognition in the succession, he would already possess connections capable of supporting his position. The marriage itself remained unusual. FitzRoy and Mary Howard were still young, and Henry reportedly prevented them from immediately living together as husband and wife. One concern was their age and the possible physical consequences of an early consummation. As a result, the marriage produced no children. During the early 1530s, Henry still had several possible solutions to the succession crisis. He could hope that Anne Boleyn would eventually produce a son. He could reconsider the status of Princess Mary. He could attempt to secure Parliament's acceptance of another arrangement. Or, under sufficiently desperate circumstances, he could attempt to place FitzRoy in the line of succession. What he intended to do cannot be established with certainty. Henry frequently altered his dynastic policy according to changing political circumstances. Nevertheless, the legal developments of 1536 brought FitzRoy unusually close to becoming a realistic candidate for the throne. Anne Boleyn's position collapsed rapidly in the spring of that year. She was arrested, accused of adultery and other serious offenses, tried and executed in May 1536. Her marriage to Henry was annulled. Elizabeth, like Mary before her, lost her legitimate status. Henry now had 2 living legitimate-born daughters who had both been legally declared illegitimate. He still had no legitimate son. Shortly after Anne's fall, Parliament passed the Second Succession Act. The legislation confirmed the exclusion of both Mary and Elizabeth from the immediate succession and, importantly, granted Henry broad authority to determine the future succession through letters patent or his will. That provision significantly increased the theoretical importance of FitzRoy. For the first time, Henry possessed a clearer legal mechanism through which he might potentially nominate someone outside the conventional legitimate line. FitzRoy was the king's only acknowledged son and had spent more than a decade being prepared for high status. He possessed royal blood, major titles, extensive estates, and a carefully constructed public identity. There is no surviving document proving that Henry had definitely decided to make FitzRoy his heir. It would therefore be too strong to claim that the boy was already destined to become king. But by 1536, the possibility could no longer be dismissed. Henry's behavior toward FitzRoy throughout his childhood had already gone far beyond ordinary paternal generosity. The king had elevated him above almost every nobleman in England, established him in regional government, provided an exceptional education, and arranged a marriage into the Howard family. If the king had wanted only to provide comfortably for an illegitimate child, much less would have been necessary. The political circumstances of 1536 made FitzRoy more valuable precisely when his physical health began to fail. During the summer, the 17-year-old Duke fell seriously ill. The speed of his physical collapse defied all expectations. FitzRoy had been relentlessly trained for an active aristocratic life, showing no prior signs of chronic weakness. Yet his vitality vanished in a matter of weeks. On July 23, 1536, Henry FitzRoy died at St. James's Palace. He was only 17. The contemporary explanation given for his death was consumption. a term commonly associated with tuberculosis. Tuberculosis could certainly kill adolescents and young adults, sometimes after a prolonged decline and sometimes more rapidly. But the circumstances following FitzRoy's death have also encouraged speculation about whether another infectious disease may have been involved. The burial arrangements were unusually restricted and hurried. FitzRoy was not given the kind of elaborate public funeral that might have been expected for a Duke of Richmond and Somerset, the acknowledged son of the king and one of the highest-ranking aristocrats in England. Henry ordered the body removed quickly. Public participation was sharply limited, and Bessie did not attend her son's burial. Contemporary chronicles present one possible explanation. FitzRoy may have died from a highly infectious form of disease, potentially pneumonic plague, which would have made rapid burial necessary. This remains an interpretation rather than a proven diagnosis. The available evidence does not allow the exact medical cause to be determined with certainty. Contemporary records continued to identify consumption as the official explanation. Whatever killed him, the political consequences were immediate. For more than a decade, Henry had possessed an acknowledged male alternative to his daughters. FitzRoy's legal illegitimacy was a serious obstacle, but one that the increasingly powerful Tudor state might conceivably have attempted to overcome. With the boy's death, that option disappeared completely. Henry was now approaching 45. Catherine of Aragon was dead. Anne Boleyn had been executed. Mary and Elizabeth had both been excluded from legitimacy by their father's policies. There was no acknowledged royal son left. Only weeks before FitzRoy's death, Henry had married Jane Seymour. The future of the Tudor dynasty now depended heavily on whether Jane could accomplish what Catherine and Anne had not: give the king a legitimate son who survived. For Bessie, however, FitzRoy's death was not merely another development in Henry's succession policy. She had lost her eldest child. The circumstance of FitzRoy's upbringing had already kept mother and son largely separate. He had been taken into the royal system from infancy and raised according to the king's dynastic needs. Bessie had built another household, married twice, and had additional children. Yet none of that changed the fact that FitzRoy was her firstborn son. His death also permanently altered Bessie's relationship to national politics. As long as FitzRoy lived, Bessie possessed a unique connection to a possible future ruler. If Henry had eventually named his son as successor, Bessie could have become the mother of the next King of England. Even without formal office, that status would have transformed her political importance. With FitzRoy dead, that possibility vanished. Henry did not replace him with another illegitimate son. No other acknowledged male child existed outside his marriages. The succession question therefore returned entirely to Henry's legitimate household and the uncertain ability of Jane Seymour to produce an heir. The timing was particularly striking. FitzRoy died in July 1536, during one of the most turbulent years of Henry's reign. Catherine of Aragon had died in January. Anne Boleyn had fallen and been executed in May. Henry had married Jane Seymour almost immediately afterward. The Second Succession Act had reorganized the legal future of the crown. Now the king's only acknowledged son was also gone. Within a few months, almost every major element of Henry's family structure had been rearranged. Bessie did not respond by returning to court politics. She remained with Edward Clinton and continued managing her aristocratic household. Her wealth and status did not disappear when FitzRoy died. Unlike her position during her youth, her adult security no longer depended on the king's romantic interest or on her son's dynastic value. She still controlled substantial interests in Lincolnshire. Her children from the Talboys and Clinton marriages connected her to several important families. Her second marriage remained intact, and royal favor toward her had not been withdrawn. The following years also brought opportunities created by Henry's religious policies. The dissolution of monasteries transferred enormous quantities of church land into royal hands. Some of this property was sold, granted, or redistributed to members of the political and landed elite. In 1539, Bessie received further grants of former monastic lands. The acquisition strengthened a position she had spent 2 decades building. The young maid of honor who once depended entirely on a place in Catherine of Aragon's chambers had become a substantial landholder in her own right. She had survived the end of her relationship with Henry, the death of her first husband, remarriage, and now the loss of FitzRoy without being pushed into financial or political obscurity. But her connection with the Tudor court was not completely finished. In 1540, nearly 3 decades after she had first entered Catherine of Aragon's household, Bessie returned to royal service. This time she would not encounter the athletic 20-something king who had once entered the Queen's chambers in elaborate masks. The Henry VIII she was about to see was a very different man. By 1540, Bessie Blount had been away from the center of the Tudor court for many years. She had built a life in Lincolnshire, married twice, raised children, accumulated property, and survived the death of Henry FitzRoy. Yet that year brought her back briefly into the royal household when she entered the service of Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's 4th wife. The return placed Bessie once again inside the world she had first entered as a young maid of honor nearly 3 decades earlier. The contrast must have been enormous. The Henry VIII Bessie had known in the 1510s was young, athletic, competitive, and highly conscious of his physical appearance. He had spent much of his early reign displaying himself through tournaments, hunting, dancing, music, elaborate clothing, and military campaigns. By 1540, that version of the king had largely disappeared. Henry was now approaching 50 and had undergone a severe physical decline. He had gained substantial weight, suffered from chronic problems with his legs, and experienced recurring ulceration that limited his mobility. His temperament had also hardened after years of political conflict, failed marriages, executions, and religious upheaval. The court Bessie returned to was therefore very different from the one in which she had first attracted his attention. Anne of Cleves had arrived in England as part of a diplomatic marriage designed to strengthen Henry's position in Europe. The marriage was arranged after the death of Jane Seymour, who had finally given Henry the legitimate son he had wanted for so long. Prince Edward had been born in 1537, solving the immediate succession problem that had dominated much of Henry's adult life. Jane, however, died shortly after childbirth. Her death left Henry with a legitimate male heir but without a queen. The search for another wife eventually led to Anne of Cleves, whose family controlled strategically important territories in the German states. The marriage was therefore shaped largely by foreign policy rather than by Henry's personal attraction. When Anne arrived, Henry quickly became dissatisfied with the match. Their marriage began in January 1540, but deteriorated almost immediately. Within months, Henry was seeking a way to end it. Bessie entered Anne's household during this unstable period. Her precise responsibilities are not described in detail in the surviving account, but serving as a lady-in-waiting brought her once again close to the machinery of royal domestic life. She would have been present within a household where everyone understood that the Queen's position was uncertain. For Bessie, this return also created an unusual personal situation. She was now serving another wife of the man whose mistress she had once been and whose son she had borne. Catherine of Aragon, the Queen Bessie had served as a teenager, was dead. Anne Boleyn had been executed. Jane Seymour had died after childbirth. Now Anne of Cleves was struggling to preserve her position only months after marrying Henry. Bessie herself had survived the same court without ever becoming politically ambitious enough to attract the king's hostility. That difference helps explain the unusual durability of her position. She had never tried to become queen. She had never publicly challenged Catherine of Aragon. She had never built a faction around her relationship with Henry. Once their affair ended, she accepted marriage away from court and established an independent aristocratic household. Even when FitzRoy became politically important, Bessie did not attempt to convert her status as his mother into direct political power. This did not make her unimportant. It made her less dangerous. By 1540, Henry had eliminated or broken many people who had once stood extremely close to him. Thomas Wolsey had fallen from power and died in 1530. Thomas More had been executed in 1535. Anne Boleyn had been executed the following year. Thomas Cromwell, the minister who had played a central role in Henry's religious and administrative revolution, was moving rapidly toward his own destruction. Bessie had survived because she had largely remained outside that competition. Her brief service to Anne of Cleves did not last long. Within approximately 4 months, Bessie became seriously ill and left court. She returned to Lincolnshire, where her condition deteriorated. The surviving evidence does not provide a definitive medical diagnosis. One possibility is tuberculosis, the disease contemporary sources associated with Henry FitzRoy's death. If Bessie suffered from the same illness, her decline may have been gradual before becoming serious enough to force her withdrawal from court. Another possibility is that her final illness followed complications associated with childbirth. Bessie had continued having children during her marriage to Edward Clinton, and the source connects her death with the possibility of postpartum infection following the birth of her youngest daughter, Margaret. Either explanation is plausible within the limits of the surviving material. Evidence suggests that Bessie died shortly after leaving Anne of Cleves's household, probably in May 1540. She was approximately 40 years old. Her death came at another turning point in Henry's reign. The king's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled in July 1540. Thomas Cromwell was executed that same month. Henry then married Catherine Howard, whose own fall would follow less than 2 years later. Bessie therefore died before witnessing the final phase of Henry's marital history. She did not see Catherine Howard's execution in 1542, Henry's final marriage to Catherine Parr in 1543, or the king's death in 1547. Nor did she live to see the extraordinary succession that followed. Prince Edward became Edward VI after Henry's death, but he died in 1553 at only 15. Mary, once pushed aside and declared illegitimate, became Queen Mary I. After her death in 1558, Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, became Elizabeth I. The Tudor succession eventually passed through both daughters Henry had once legally excluded. The son Bessie had given him never entered that sequence. Henry FitzRoy's early death ensured that historians could never know whether Henry VIII would ultimately have attempted to place him in the succession. It is possible that FitzRoy would have remained simply an extremely powerful royal duke. It is also possible that, had Jane Seymour failed to produce Edward, Henry might have tried to use the legal authority granted to him in 1536 to nominate FitzRoy. The evidence does not allow certainty. What is clear is that Henry had invested far more in FitzRoy than he would have needed to invest in an ordinary illegitimate son. Titles, enormous estates, regional authority, elite education, and marriage into the Howard family all gave the boy a political profile that could have supported a much larger future role. Her life is best viewed through this lens. She was neither an insignificant mistress nor a hidden architect of the English Reformation. Both extremes simplify the evidence. She was a woman whose private relationship with Henry VIII produced an unusually important dynastic consequence, and whose family benefited substantially from royal patronage. Her greatest historical significance lies in Henry FitzRoy. His birth proved to Henry that he could father a son. His childhood offered the king a potential alternative to an uncertain legitimate succession. His titles and education showed how seriously Henry regarded him. His death in 1536 removed that alternative at precisely the moment when Henry still lacked a legitimate male heir. Bessie's role was therefore central to one of the most persistent problems of Henry VIII's reign, without making her a central political actor herself. Her story shows that the Tudor succession crisis was not shaped only by statutes, marriages, ministers, and religious arguments. It was also shaped by childbirth, fertility, disease, and survival. The political future of a dynasty could depend on whether a particular child lived for a few weeks, several years, or long enough to inherit a crown. While Catherine of Aragon prayed for a male heir and Anne Boleyn bled to secure one, a provincial gentry daughter achieved the impossible in utter silence. Bessie Blount left no monumental tomb in Peterborough, claimed no political faction at court, and faced no executioner's blade. Her footprint simply vanished from the physical landscape. Yet, by quietly providing Henry VIII with the one healthy son his anointed queens could not, she forced the English Parliament to redefine the succession and granted the king a living, breathing alternative that haunted his dynastic calculations for 17 years. Did this forgotten woman ultimately shape the Tudor succession more profoundly than the queens who wore the crown?